The four-wheel drive truck had that new car smell, which just made me feel out of place. I'd been on my sister's couch in Boise for 4 months. The cushions still held the shape of my body when I finally got up that morning. Lisa stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching me load my duffel bag and the single plastic tub of my remaining things. She made me promise to call her every evening, on the station landline. She said it twice. "Every evening, Dale. Not when you remember." "I will. I mean it." "I know." She hugged me hard, then let go. That was 6 hours ago. The road up Mount Sarita was 8 miles of gravel and washboard, winding through stands of hemlock so thick the daylight turned green and soft. When I finally pulled into the clearing, the place looked exactly like the photos Cascade Vent had emailed me, a low equipment shed built of corrugated metal. A smaller cabin for the caretaker, a big concrete pad in the middle, studded with seismic instruments, with 4 sodium floodlights on tall poles at the corners. Everything was quiet. The only sound was the engine ticking as it cooled. I got out. The air was colder up here, thin and clean, smelling of pine resin and damp earth. I'd taken the 6-week contract because it paid $1,100 a week, and because it meant I'd be working with instruments again. My university grant had ended in the spring. There weren't a lot of openings for a seismologist without a current project. This was the first concrete thing that had come along. The key they'd mailed me fit the padlock on the equipment shed. Inside, it was dim and smelled of old paper and machine oil. My first job was to check the drum recorders, make sure they were running, that the needles weren't stuck. I found the main bank of them against the far wall, their papers scrolling slowly, silently. Beside them was a metal desk with a row of drawers. The bottom one was jammed. I tugged at it, but it wouldn't budge. A thin strip of metal along the top of the frame was bent inward, pinning it shut. I got a screwdriver from my toolbox and pried the strip back. It gave with a metallic screech. The drawer slid open. Inside, on top of a stack of old maintenance forms and supply invoices, was a hardcover notebook, a field journal. The cover was scuffed and stained with what looked like coffee. I picked it up. On the first page, in blocky capital letters, it said, "Elijah Leonard, caretaker." I looked up. There was a photograph tacked to the wall beside the shed door, a color print gone faded and yellow. It showed a man in his 50s, rangy and tall, standing right here in this doorway. He had a hooked nose and deep-set eyes, and he wasn't smiling. Elijah Leonard. I took the journal and the photo back to the caretaker's cabin. The cabin was one room, a bed, a desk, a small kitchenette, and a landline phone on the wall. I put the photo on the desk and started reading. Elijah's handwriting was neat, almost mechanical. The early entries were just logs, temperature readings, equipment checks, propane levels. Then, about 3 months in, he started noting something else. Low harmonic tremor recorded at 0240. Lasted 8 minutes. Pattern holds every 9th night. Not in the manual. A few entries later. Tremor at 0240. Lights flickered. Saw something come up the service road. Tall. Joints all wrong. Stopped at the tree line. Didn't cross. And then, a rule, underlined. It won't cross into the clearing while the 4 floods over the pad are lit. Keep them on. Check the relay. I read that part twice. I got up and looked out the window at the concrete pad. The 4 floodlights were dark now in the daylight, but I could see the heavy cables running down the poles to a junction box. I sat back down and kept reading until the light faded, and I had to turn on the desk lamp. Every 9th night. 2:40 in the morning. A wrong-jointed figure that stopped at the trees. I closed the journal. My first thought wasn't about what it meant. It was that I needed to add the tremor to my own monitoring schedule. I wrote it down in my notebook. Check recorder 0240 9-night cycle. The next afternoon, I was out at the equipment pad with Elijah's journal, comparing his notes to the instrument placements. That's when I saw it. One of the metal rebar caps set into the concrete edge was loose. Not just loose. It was tilted up, as if something had pushed it from below. A thin line of fresh dirt led away from it, across the gravel toward the tree line. I knelt down. The cap was cold under my fingers. I tried to twist it, and it turned easily, the threads grinding. I tightened it back down until it was flush with the concrete. Vandalism, probably. Kids from somewhere, though I hadn't seen another soul. I wrote it up in the station log as minor tampering, repaired. Then I added in my own notes, tremor watch. Next expected in. I counted the days from Elijah's last entry. 17 days. I wrote that down too. 2 days later, the propane truck showed up. I was in the equipment shed when I heard it grinding up the gravel road. A big tanker truck with the Cascade Vent logo on the side. The driver climbed out. He was a thick-set man in coveralls with close-cropped black hair going gray at the temples. He had a genial, round face and a smile that seemed practiced. "You must be the new guy," he said, walking over with his hand out. "Spencer Schultz. I do the fuel runs." We shook. His grip was firm, his knuckles stained with grease. "Dale Gross. Welcome to the mountain, Dale. Just here to keep your tanks topped off." He went about his work, connecting hoses, checking gauges. He talked the whole time, about the weather turning, about how quiet it got up here in the fall. It was friendly, easy. Then, as he was finishing up, I made a mistake. "I found the previous caretaker's journal," I said. "Elijah Leonard. He kept good notes." Spencer's back was to me, but I saw his shoulders stiffen. He turned around slowly. The easy smile was still there, but it didn't reach his eyes anymore. "Elijah," he said. "Yeah, he just walked off the job one day. Never said why. Some people aren't cut out for the solitude." He coiled the hose, his movements deliberate. "Those floodlights over the pad still working okay?" "They seem to be." "Good. You keep an eye on those. Important for security." He latched the access panel on the tank. "Well, that's you set for a while." He started walking back to his truck, then stopped, as if remembering something. "You got any empty fuel cans need taking down? Saves you a trip." I'd set an old red plastic can by the shed door, meaning to ditch it later. "That one there," I said. He picked it up, hefted it. "I'll get rid of it for you." He gave me a nod. "You take care, Dale. Don't work too hard." He climbed into the cab and the big truck rumbled to life. I watched him turn it around in the clearing, gravel crunching under the tires, and head back down the service road. When the sound of the engine had faded into the trees, the silence felt heavier than before. I looked at the spot where the red can had been. Then I went inside, to the desk where Elijah Leonard's journal lay open, and I read the rule one more time. It won't cross into the clearing while the 4 floods over the pad are lit. I believed him. The 3 weeks passed quietly. The drum recorders ticked along, their needles tracing smooth, uneventful lines. I checked them twice a day, filled out the daily reports for Cascade Vent, and kept my own log. In the evenings, I'd sit at the desk with Elijah Leonard's journal open beside my notebook, comparing dates. The pattern held. Exactly every 9 nights, according to his entries, the harmonic tremor had registered. Low frequency, lasting between 6 and 10 minutes. My own record showed the same thing. A minor seismic event, the kind that wouldn't even register on most networks. But it was there, regular as a heartbeat. The next one was due tonight. I looked at the clock on the cabin wall. It was just past 10 in the evening. The tremor, if it came, would start at 2:40 in the morning. I'd been sleeping through them, trusting the instruments to catch it. But that felt wrong now. Like I was ignoring a knock at the door. I decided to stay up. I made a pot of coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, filled my thermos, and carried it out to the equipment shed. The shed was cold at night, the metal walls holding the day's chill. I pulled a chair over to the bank of drum recorders and sat down. The paper scrolled by, silent and steady. I drank the coffee and waited. The numbers on the digital clock above the desk changed slowly. 11. Midnight. 1. By 2 o'clock, my eyes felt gritty and my neck was stiff. I stood up and paced the length of the shed a few times, my boots echoing on the concrete floor. I looked at the security monitor mounted in the corner. Its screen showed 4 grainy views: the equipment pad, the service road, the tree line to the north, the shed door itself. Everything was still, painted in shades of green and black by the night vision camera. At 2:38, I was sitting again, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees. At 2:39, I held my breath without meaning to. The needle jumped. It was a sharp, sudden vibration, a scribble of ink on the otherwise smooth line. At the same instant, the 4 sodium floodlights over the concrete pad outside flickered, a single, violent pulse of light that bleached the security monitor white for a second, and went dark. The shed was plunged into a deeper black, lit only by the dim glow of the instrument panel. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stared at the security monitor as the image swam back into focus. On the screen that showed the service road, something was moving. It came up the gravel track, a tall, thin shape. The camera didn't pick up details, just a silhouette against the slightly lighter dark of the sky. But the proportions were wrong. The legs were too long, the arms hanging at angles that didn't look human. Its head was a small, dark knob atop a slender neck. It moved with a stiff, jerking gait, like a puppet being pulled by strings. It reached the edge of the clearing, where the gravel met the thick line of hemlocks, and stopped. It stood there, motionless, facing the dark equipment pad. Elijah's words weren't about something that happened months ago. They were instructions for tonight. I didn't think. I pushed back from the chair and stumbled to the far wall, to the metal cabinet that housed the backup systems. My fingers fumbled with the latch. Inside was a small gasoline generator, a transfer switch, and a row of circuit breakers. I found the main switch for the floodlight circuit and threw it. Nothing. I traced the wiring with my flashlight beam. The problem wasn't at the box. It was upstream. The relay. I remembered Elijah's note. Check the relay. The old mechanical relay was mounted in a separate housing on the side of the shed, exposed to the weather. I shoved the shed door open and ran around the corner, the cold night air biting through my flannel. The relay box was a small, rusty metal case. I popped the cover off. Inside, a series of copper contacts were blackened and fused together. It had failed, probably arced over when the tremor hit. I sprinted back inside, my breath coming in ragged clouds. The spare parts were on a shelf near the desk. I found a new relay, still in its plastic blister pack, and a set of screwdrivers. My hands were shaking. I forced myself to slow down, to match the screws to the driver. It took me 4 minutes. 4 minutes of working by the beam of my flashlight held in my teeth, with that thing standing at the tree line on the monitor behind me. I connected the last wire, snapped the new relay into place, and closed the box. I ran back inside and threw the main switch. With a deep, resonant hum, the 4 floodlights over the pad ignited. Their harsh white light flooded the clearing, washing out the security monitor for a second before it adjusted. I leaned over the screen, my pulse roaring in my ears. The figure was still there. It hadn't moved. It stood at the exact edge of the tree line, just outside the circle of light thrown by the floods. It was simply standing, facing the pad. Then, as I watched, it took one slow, stiff step backward, merging into the shadows of the trees, and was gone. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. My knees felt weak. I sank back into the chair and stared at the now empty screen. Elijah was right. It wouldn't cross while the lights were on. I didn't sleep. I sat in the shed until the sky began to lighten from black to deep blue. As soon as it was fully dawn, I went out to the equipment pad with my toolkit. The floodlights were still on, buzzing quietly in the morning air. I examined the junction box first. The wiring was old, but intact. No cuts, no fraying. Then I went to the relay housing I'd replaced. I opened it again in the daylight. The old relay inside was clearly fried, the contacts welded together by a surge of power. The new one looked fine. So the tremor had caused a power surge. The old relay had taken the hit and died, killing the lights. It was a mechanical failure, not sabotage. I took the burned-out relay back to the shed and set it on the desk next to Elijah's journal. Proof of a sort. I made the call around 9 in the morning. The landline phone in the cabin had a long cord. I paced the length of it, listening to the ring. Lisa picked up on the third ring.
Dale?
Hey.
You're calling late. Everything okay?
Her voice was warm, but I heard the edge of concern underneath. Yeah, no. Something happened last night. I told her. I kept it simple. The tremor. The lights going out. The figure on the service road. I didn't try to explain what it was. I just described what I saw. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the hum of her refrigerator in the background.
Dale,
she said finally, and her voice had changed.
Leave the mountain. Right now. Pack your things and come home.
It's not like that, I said. The lights came back on. It stayed at the trees.
I don't care. You're not safe there. Whatever that is, you don't get paid enough to deal with it.
It's $1,100 a week, Lisa. The number hung in the air between us. I've got 3 weeks left on the contract. That's money I can actually use. To pay you back for everything.
I don't want the money back. I want you to come home.
And then what? I heard the frustration in my own voice and tried to dial it back. This is the first real work I've had since the grant collapsed. If I walk off the job, Cascade Vent isn't going to give me a reference. I go back to your couch. I go back to nothing. She didn't answer right away. I heard her sigh, a soft, tired sound.
So, you're staying?
I'm staying, for now. I'm careful. I've got the journal. I know the rules.
Rules written by a man who isn't there anymore,
she said. We talked for a few more minutes, circling the same argument without landing anywhere new. She made me promise to call again tomorrow. I promised. When we hung up, the cabin felt quieter than ever. I spent the afternoon reading, not just the early entries in Elijah's journal, but the later ones, the pages closer to the end. His tone changed. The fear was still there, but it had cooled into something harder, more observational. In one entry, about 2 months before the last date, he wrote, "Figure is not hunting me. It is watching the pad. It wants what is under the concrete. Do not open the pad." The sentence was underlined 3 times. The entries became sparser after that. Just maintenance notes, supply levels. Then, on the final page, the night he vanished, he'd written only 5 words. "It is not here for me." I closed the journal and looked out the window at the concrete pad. The floodlights were off now in the daytime. It looked innocuous, just a slab of gray in the middle of the gravel. As evening approached, I took a wrench and a flashlight and went out to examine the pad itself. I started at the edges, checking each of the metal rebar caps set into the concrete. The one I'd tightened weeks ago was loose again. Not just loose. The threads were freshly scored, shiny where a tool had recently bitten into the metal. I checked the others. 2 more caps, on the opposite side of the pad, showed the same fresh tool marks. Someone had been here, recently, trying to get underneath. I tightened them all down, my knuckles white on the wrench. Then I stood up, the cold evening air seeping through my jacket. I wasn't leaving. Not until I knew who was coming up here to work on this pad in the middle of the night and what they were trying to do. I'd tell Cascade Vent, but not yet. First, I needed to see it for myself. The morning after I found the fresh tool marks on the rebar caps, I was in the equipment shed checking the drum recorders when I heard the truck. It was early, the sun barely clearing the tops of the pines, and the sound of the engine grinding up the service road didn't fit the schedule. Propane was supposed to come every 2 weeks, and Spencer had been here less than 1. He pulled up in the same tanker truck, same Cascade Vent logo on the door. He climbed out, his coveralls clean, his cap pulled low. He gave me that practiced smile as he walked over. "Morning, Dale. Sorry for the surprise visit." "You're early," I said. "Got a call from the office," he said, shrugging. "Wanted me to swing by and check a pressure valve on your main tank. Routine thing. Won't take long." He went to the big propane tank and started unscrewing the access panel. I watched him. His movements were smooth, practiced. He didn't look at me. "I've been reading Elijah Leonard's journal," I said. His hand stilled for just a second. Then he kept turning the wrench. "That's so. He wrote a lot about the pad, about the lights." "Elijah had a lot of theories," Spencer said, his voice casual, but I could hear the edge underneath. "Man spent too much time up here alone." "What happened to him?" I asked. Spencer finished with the valve, snapped the panel shut, and finally turned around. The easy smile was gone. "Now, Dale, some questions don't have good answers. Best to leave the past where it lies." "He just walked off the job? That's what you said." "That's what happened." He wiped his hands on a rag he pulled from his pocket. "Listen, the old lower cabin, Elijah's old place, it's off limits. Structures unsafe, whole hillsides unstable. Cascade Vent doesn't want anyone hiking down there. You understand?" "Why?" "Because I'm telling you not to." The words came out flat, final. He held my gaze for a moment, then looked past me at the concrete pad. "Those floodlights still holding?" "They're on." "Good. Keep them that way." He tossed the rag onto the passenger seat of his truck. "That's all I needed. You take care." He climbed into the cab, started the engine, and backed the big truck around in a wide arc. He didn't look at me again as he drove away. I stood there in the quiet of the clearing, the smell of diesel lingering in the cold air, and I knew two things. One, he was lying about the valve. Two, I was going to hike down to that cabin. I waited a day. I did my rounds, filled out the reports, pretended everything was normal. The next afternoon, with the sun high enough to throw long shadows through the trees, I took a backpack with some water, a flashlight, and a pry bar, and I found the old trail. It wasn't much of a path, just a faint break in the undergrowth winding down the slope through thick stands of hemlock. The air grew damper, colder, as I descended. After about 20 minutes, I saw the roof of the lower cabin through the branches. The place was small, even more so than the one up at the station. It was built of the same corrugated metal, but time and weather had left it rust-streaked and bowed. The door was ajar, the wood around the latch splintered. Someone had forced it open. I pushed inside. The single room was dark, the only light coming from a grimy window above a narrow bunk. The air smelled of mildew and old wood smoke. There was a small table, a chair, a cold wood stove. Everything was still, covered in a fine layer of dust. I checked under the bunk. Behind a stack of empty crates, my flashlight beam caught the corner of a steel footlocker. It was army green, heavy-looking, with a solid padlock looped through the hasp. I pulled it out into the open. The lock was sturdy, brass, and it didn't budge when I tugged at it. I tried the keys from the station, the shed key, the cabin key, a few others on the ring, but none of them fit. I sat back on my heels. The lock was too strong to break without making a hell of a noise. I marked the spot in my mind, put the footlocker back, and left the cabin as I found it. The following afternoon, I went back down with the pry bar. The day was overcast, the light in the woods flat and gray. This time I didn't hesitate. I wedged the flat end of the bar into the gap between the hasp and the locker's body and leaned into it. Metal groaned, then gave with a sharp, tearing crack. The padlock held, but the hasp ripped clean from the steel. I lifted the lid. Inside, on top of a folded blanket, was a ledger, a simple, hardbound accounting book. I picked it up and sat on the dusty floor, my back against the cold wall. Elijah's handwriting filled the pages, the same neat, blocky print as his journal. But this wasn't about tremors or figures at the tree line. This was a record of Spencer Schultz. The entries started over a year ago. Short, factual notes. Schultz loosened NE cap, placed deer heart beneath. Full moon. Schultz left rabbit carcass at SW edge. Lights stayed on. Figure observed for 20 minutes. Schultz requested I disable relay during next tremor. Refused. The dates tracked with the 9-night cycle. Spencer wasn't just delivering propane. He was using the figure, the warden, Elijah called it in one later entry, to do his digging for him. He'd loosen the caps, place what he called offerings under the concrete slab, and let the thing's appearances scare off anyone who might look too close. He was trying to unearth whatever was buried beneath the pad. I turned the page. The tone changed. Schultz threatened me today, said I was in his way, said the lights were ruining years of work, told him I wouldn't help. He said it would be a shame if a caretaker had an accident up here alone. And then, the final entry, dated the day before Elijah's journal ended. Schultz came after dark, demanded I cut the lights for the next tremor. I refused. He said fine. He said he could wait for the next guy. He said he'd make sure the next caretaker was someone who needed the money too much to ask questions. I closed the ledger. My hands were steady, but my throat felt tight. The pieces locked together. Spencer had killed him, or he'd let the thing do it for him. And then he'd recommended me for the job. A seismologist with a collapsed grant, desperate enough to take a short-term contract in the middle of nowhere. Someone who wouldn't last. I hiked back up to the station as the early winter dark began to settle in. I didn't run. I walked, the ledger tucked inside my coat, the weight of it against my ribs. That evening I called Lisa. She picked up on the first ring.
Dale,
It's me.
you're calling late again.
Her voice was already wary. I found something. Elijah Leonard, the last caretaker. He's dead. Spencer Schultz killed him. There was a silence on the line. Then,
Okay, Dale. I want you to listen to me very carefully. Get in your truck right now. Don't pack anything. Don't even turn off the lights. Just drive. Come home.
I will, I said. But I have to secure the seismic records first. If I just take them, it's theft. If I leave them, he destroys them. I need to copy the data, make a backup. Then I'll leave.
Dale, no. You don't get it. He killed someone. The data doesn't matter. Leave it.
It matters to me, I said, and I heard the stubbornness in my own voice. I've got 3 days until the next tremor. I'll be gone before then. I promise. She sighed, a long, exhausted sound.
You promise a lot of things.
This time I mean it. We hung up with the same unresolved tension humming between us. I didn't sleep. I worked. I built a backup circuit for the floodlights, splicing into the generator line with spare wire and a separate relay I mounted inside the equipment shed, away from the weather. If Spencer tampered with the main box again, I could throw a switch and keep the lights on from in here. I moved the most critical drum recorder and the security monitor into the caretaker's cabin, setting them up on the small table by the window. Now I could watch the pad and the service road without leaving this room. Finally, I took Elijah's ledger and wrapped it in a plastic bag. I kept it in the inside pocket of my field jacket, where it sat against my chest. A flat, hard rectangle of proof. I looked out the window at the darkening clearing, at the 4 floodlights blazing over the empty concrete pad, and I waited. I sat in the equipment shed with the new relay in my hands, the one I'd installed 3 nights before, and tried to understand what I was looking at. The wires to my backup circuit were cleanly snipped, not pulled loose, not chewed by an animal. Cut with wire cutters, the copper ends bright and sharp in the beam of my flashlight. Someone had come into the shed while I was sleeping and done it. I set the flashlight down on the metal desk and opened the main junction box. The primary circuit was still intact. The 4 floodlights outside were still on, their white hum bleeding through the shed's small window. But the backup, the separate relay I'd wired straight to the generator, the one that was supposed to keep the lights on if the main line failed, was dead. The cut wires hung limp. I closed the box. My hands were steady. It was a cold, methodical feeling, like checking an equation and finding a negative where a positive should be. I didn't panic. I went to the spare parts shelf, got my wire strippers and a roll of electrical tape, and sat down on the concrete floor to fix it. It took about 20 minutes. I spliced the wires back together, wrapped each joint in tape, and mounted the relay back in its housing. I threw the switch. The small indicator light on the backup panel glowed green. Good. I stood up, my knees cracking. I decided to do a full perimeter check. I took the flashlight and went outside, the cold night air sharp in my lungs. The 4 floodlights over the concrete pad were blazing, turning the gravel into a flat, white plain. I walked the edge of the pad, checking each of the metal rebar caps set into the concrete. 1, 2, 3, 4. I stopped. There were supposed to be 6. I counted again, walking the full rectangle. The cap on the northeast corner was gone. Just an empty, threaded hole, the concrete around it chipped and raw, like it had been wrenched out with a lot of force. I shone the light into the hole. It was deep, maybe 2 feet, and it was empty. No dirt, no gravel, just a dark shaft going down. I knelt and ran my fingers over the fresh scars in the concrete. This had been done tonight, while I was in the cabin, or while I was in the shed earlier. Someone had been here, working quietly, while the lights were on. I stood and swept the flashlight beam across the clearing, toward the service road. The gravel was churned up, not just from my truck. There were fresh tire tracks, wide and deep, the kind made by a heavy vehicle. They came up the road, circled near the pad, and then went back down. They hadn't been there this afternoon. Spencer's propane truck. He wasn't due for another week. The next tremor was in 3 days. He'd come back early. I went back inside the shed and sat at the desk. I looked at the security monitor I'd moved into the cabin. The screen showed 4 green-tinted views: the pad, the road, the trees, the shed door. All empty. All still. I thought about calling Lisa. It was late, but she'd want to know. I thought about calling Cascade Vent, reporting the vandalism. But I didn't move. I just sat there, watching the screen, listening to the quiet hum of the instruments, until the sky outside began to lighten. The next day passed in a slow, tense routine. I did my instrument checks, filled out the daily report, and tightened the 5 remaining rebar caps as hard as I could. I kept Elijah's ledger in my jacket pocket. I could feel it there, a hard rectangle against my ribs every time I moved. I thought about driving down the mountain. I had the truck. I could be in Boise by dinner. But I didn't go. The money was part of it. $1,100 a week, with 1 week left. But it wasn't just the money. It was the ledger. It was the proof. If I left, Spencer would just erase it. He'd take the locker, burn the journal, and the next guy would show up knowing nothing. Elijah would stay vanished. I couldn't do that. Evening came on, the sky turning a deep, cold blue. I was in the cabin, heating a can of soup on the hot plate, when I heard the truck. The familiar grind of a big engine, the crunch of gravel under heavy tires. I looked out the window. Spencer's propane tanker was pulling into the clearing, its headlights cutting twin cones through the twilight. He parked near the big tank and climbed out. He was wearing his coveralls, his cap pulled low. He saw me in the window and gave a little wave, that same easy smile on his face. I went to the door and opened it. "Evening, Dale," he called, walking over. "Sorry for the drop-in. Office called. Said your usage spiked on the last remote read. Wanted me to do an emergency top-off, check for a leak." "I haven't used any extra," I said. He shrugged, his hands in his pockets. "Could be a faulty sensor." You know how it is. Better safe than sorry. Mind if I come in for a minute? Need to check the regulator on your wall unit. I looked at him. I looked at his truck. I thought about the cut wires, the missing cap, the tire tracks in the gravel. I thought about the fuel. The station needed it. The generator, the heaters. They all ran on propane. If I turned him away, I'd be in the dark and the cold in a few days. And I needed him talking. I needed him here, where I could watch him, until I could get to the landline and make a call. Okay, I said. Come on in. He stepped inside, bringing the smell of cold air and diesel with him. He looked around the small cabin, his eyes taking in the desk, the bed, the security monitor on the table. Cozy, he said. The regulator's over there, I said, pointing to the wall by the kitchenette. Right. He went over and made a show of checking the gauge, tapping it with a finger. Seems fine. Probably just a glitch in the remote system. He turned around, leaning against the wall. You making coffee? Long drive up. I had a pot going on the hot plate next to the soup. It was cheap, bitter stuff, but it was hot. Yeah. Mind if I have a cup? Take the chill off. I didn't want to give him anything, but saying no felt like showing my hand. Sure, I said. I took 2 mugs from the shelf, poured the coffee, and handed him one. Thanks. He took a sip, grimaced slightly, then smiled. Strong. I took my own mug and sat at the desk, facing him. The landline phone was on the wall, maybe 10 feet away. I could get to it in 3 strides. So, he said, blowing on his coffee, you settling in all right? Not getting too spooked up here all alone? I'm fine, I said. Good, good. He took another sip, his eyes drifting to the window, to the floodlit pad outside. Those lights holding up? They're on. That's the main thing. He was quiet for a moment, just sipping his coffee. Then he said, You ever get curious about what's under all that concrete? I kept my face still. It's a seismic pad. For instruments. Sure, he said, nodding. Sure it is. He set his mug down on the counter. But a pad that thick, that much rebar, for a few little seismometers, seems like overkill, don't it? I didn't answer. I was calculating the distance to the phone. If I moved now, he'd be between me and the door. I needed him to turn, to look away. Elijah was curious too, Spencer said, his voice dropping into a softer, more conversational tone. Real curious man. Asked a lot of questions. Same as you. My fingers tightened around my mug. What happened to him? Spencer's smile didn't waver. Now, Dale, I told you. Some questions don't have good answers. He pushed off from the wall and took a step toward the desk. You finish your coffee. Gets cold fast up here. I took a drink. It tasted like it always did. Bitter. Hot. I set the mug down. My head felt heavy suddenly. A thick, woolly sensation starting at the base of my skull and spreading forward. The room seemed to tilt, just a little. I blinked, trying to clear it. Spencer was watching me, his head tilted. You all right? You look pale. I'm fine, I said, but the words came out slow, slurred. I tried to stand up. My legs wouldn't cooperate. The floor rushed up to meet me, and the last thing I saw was the scuffed toe of Spencer's boot right in front of my face. I woke up to the smell of damp earth and concrete dust. My head was splitting, a dull, throbbing ache behind my eyes. My wrists were bound together in front of me with a rough plastic zip tie. I was lying on my side on cold gravel. I pushed myself up, the world swimming. I was at the edge of the equipment pad. The 4 floodlight poles stood dark and silent against the night sky. The lights were out. Wires hung from the junction box, cleanly severed. Spencer had cut them. A trench had been dug into the pad near where I lay. He'd removed 3 of the rebar caps and used a sledgehammer to break through the concrete. Chunks of gray rubble were piled to the side. The hole was about 3 feet across, and it went down into blackness. Spencer was standing a few yards away, his back to me, looking down into the trench. He had a heavy flashlight in one hand. He must have heard me move, because he turned around. "There he is," he said, his voice calm, almost cheerful. "Took you long enough. That was just a little animal tranquilizer. Should have worn off quicker." I tried to speak. My mouth was dry, my tongue thick. "What are you doing?" "Finishing the job," he said. He walked over and shone the flashlight in my face. I winced, turning my head away. Elijah wouldn't help. He got scared, started writing things down, making rules. "But you're practical. You see how this works now, don't you?" I didn't answer. I was testing the zip tie. It was tight, biting into my skin, but if I could get leverage... "The thing that comes up the road," Spencer said, lowering the flashlight. "It's not here for us. It's here for what's under this pad. But it won't cross the light. So you have to turn the lights off. And you have to give it a reason to come all the way in." He nodded toward me. "A trade. A caretaker outside the lights while the hole is open. That should keep it busy for a good long while. Long enough for me to get down there and see what's really buried." He checked his watch, then looked up at the dark tree line. 2:40, any minute now. A low vibration started in the ground, a deep hum I felt in my teeth. The tremor. The instruments in the shed would be recording it. The needles would be jumping, but the lights were out. The rule was broken. Spencer smiled, a wide, genuine smile this time. "Right on schedule." He picked up a canvas bag from the ground and slung it over his shoulder. "You sit tight, Dale. This won't take long." Then he turned and walked away, not toward his truck, but toward the dark shape of the equipment shed. He was going for the records. He was going to erase everything. I was alone in the dark, my wrists bound, sitting beside a hole in the concrete as the mountain began to shake. The plastic zip tie bit into my wrists. I pulled against it, feeling the edges scrape skin, but it didn't give. Spencer had his back to me, his flashlight beam aimed down into the hole he'd made in the pad. He'd taken the pry bar from his truck and was working the edge of it into a crack in the concrete, levering up another chunk. The sound of breaking stone was sharp and dry in the cold air. He wasn't looking at me. He was focused on the trench, on widening it. I understood the plan then, with a cold, simple clarity. He was going to leave me here, bound and out in the open, while he went down into whatever was under the concrete. A trade, a caretaker for whatever was buried. The tremor was due any minute. He'd timed it. The ground started to hum. It was a low vibration that came up through the gravel and into my bones, a deep resonance that made my teeth ache. The 4 floodlight poles around the pad shuddered, and then their white light died all at once. Not a flicker, a sudden total blackout. The world went dark and silent except for that hum. From down the service road I heard the gravel crunch, not the soft, scattered sound of an animal. The deliberate, heavy crunch of something walking on 2 feet. I twisted around, my bound hands useless in front of me, and looked toward the tree line. It came up the road, the warden. In the starlight, it was a tall, thin silhouette, all wrong angles. It didn't hurry. It walked with that same stiff, jerking gait I'd seen on the monitor, but it didn't stop at the edge of the trees this time. It stepped past the first line of hemlocks and into the clearing. My breath caught in my throat. It was crossing. For the first time. It moved past me, maybe 6 feet to my left. It didn't turn its head. It didn't seem to see me at all. It just walked, straight toward the trench where Spencer was standing. Spencer had frozen, the pry bar held loosely in one hand. He shone his flashlight beam at the figure. The light didn't illuminate it. Not really. It just made the silhouette sharper, a cutout of deeper black against the night. "All right," Spencer said, his voice tight but steady. "All right. There you are." The warden stopped at the edge of the broken concrete. It stood there, looking down at Spencer in the trench. Spencer swallowed, the sound loud in the humming dark. He shifted his grip on the pry bar, not as a weapon, but as a tool. He turned back to the hole, to the dark cavity he'd exposed beneath the slab. He drove the bar down into the opening, leaning his weight into it, trying to pry something loose. That's when the warden moved. It was fast, a blur of long limbs. It reached down into the trench, its hands closing around Spencer's shoulders. Spencer yelled, a short, startled sound that was cut off as he was yanked off his feet. The pry bar clattered against the concrete. The flashlight fell, its beam spinning wildly across the ground before going out. I saw Spencer's face for a second, eyes wide and white in the dark, mouth open in a silent scream. Then he was pulled down into the cavity under the pad. There was a sound then, not a scream, but a wet, tearing crunch, like green wood breaking. It happened once, then again. Then there was only the hum of the tremor, which was already beginning to fade. The warden straightened up. It stood over the trench for a moment, then it turned. It walked back the way it had come, past me again, that same stiff, unhurried pace. It crossed the tree line and melted into the shadows between the trunks. Gone. The tremor stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. I was alone. My wrists were still bound. Spencer was gone. The floodlights were out. I took a deep, shaky breath and pushed myself to my knees. The pry bar was lying a few feet away, near the edge of the trench. I shuffled over to it on my knees, the gravel digging into my legs. I got my hands around the metal shaft. One end was tapered, broken off jagged from where he'd been levering concrete. I sawed the plastic zip tie against the sharp edge. Back and forth, back and forth. The plastic frayed, then snapped. My hands came free. I scrambled to my feet, my legs numb and tingling. I didn't look into the trench. I ran for the equipment shed. The door was unlocked. Inside, it was pitch black. I felt along the wall for the flashlight I kept on the hook, my fingers closing over the cold metal. I clicked it on. The beam found the junction box. The wires to the main floodlight circuit were severed, clean cuts. Spencer had done that before he dragged me out here. I went to the backup panel, the one I'd rewired. The indicator light was dark. He'd found that too. Cut it again. But the wires were there. My tools were on the shelf. I worked fast, my hands moving on their own. Strip the ends, twist the copper together, wrap the joint in electrical tape. I didn't think. I just made the connections, one after another, my breath loud in the quiet shed. I threw the switch. Outside, through the small window, a harsh white light bloomed. The 4 floods over the pad ignited with a deep hum. I leaned against the wall, my heart hammering against my ribs, and looked out. The pad was lit up like a stage. The trench was a dark gash in the concrete. At the edge of the tree line, just outside the circle of light, the warden stood. It was motionless, facing the pad just like before. It had withdrawn. It was obeying the boundary again. I stood there until the sky began to lighten from black to a deep, cold blue. When I could see the shapes of the trees without the floods, I went back out. The trench was about 3 feet wide and 4 feet long. I didn't look into it. I didn't need to. I gathered the chunks of broken concrete and stacked them to the side. I found the 3 missing rebar caps in the gravel nearby and screwed them back into their holes as tight as I could by hand. In the shed, there were 2 steel plates meant for patching the roof. I carried them out and laid them over the damaged section of the pad. They didn't cover it completely, but they covered enough. I mixed a bag of quick-set repair compound with water in a bucket and troweled it over the plates and the cracks, sealing the edges. It would hold. For now. I went back to the lower cabin one last time. The footlocker was still there, the lid open. I took Elijah's ledger and his journal. I put them in my backpack, along with the seismic records from the drum recorder in the cabin. The ones in the shed I left running. The needle was tracing a quiet, steady line again. I packed my duffel bag and my plastic tub of things. I loaded them into the Cascade vent truck. I did a final walkthrough of the caretaker's cabin, checking the hot plate was off. The faucet wasn't dripping. It looked the same as it had the day I arrived, just emptier. I drove down the 8-mile service road as the sun cleared the ridge. The trees flashed by, green and gold in the morning light. I reached the valley floor, found a cell signal, and pulled over. I called Cascade Vent first. I told the dispatcher that Spencer Schultz had never shown up for the scheduled fuel delivery. I said I'd waited, but I had to leave for my next contract. She sounded bored. She said she'd noted. Then I called the sheriff's office in Aldermere. I asked for Oscar Stark. He came on the line after a minute, his voice dry and measured.
Stark.
Sheriff, this is Dale Gross. I was the caretaker up at the Mount Sarita station.
Mr. Gross, what can I do for you?
I'm reporting that the propane driver, Spencer Schultz, missed his appointment. He was supposed to come by last night to refill the tanks. He never showed. I waited until this morning. There was a pause on the line. I could hear the faint scratch of a pen on paper.
Last known contact?
He was here 3 days ago for a routine check. Said he'd be back last night. He wasn't.
You checked the road? Any sign of his truck?
I didn't see it on my way down, I said. But I didn't look off the sides. The road's narrow in places. Another pause.
All right. I'll put out a notice. We'll take a drive up there later today. You headed out?
Yes, sir. My contract's up.
Safe travels then. Thanks for the call.
We hung up. I sat there for a minute, the phone warm in my hand, looking back up the road that wound into the mountains. I hadn't reported Elijah. I hadn't reported the warden. I hadn't reported the cavity under the pad or what was in it. I had the journal and the ledger in my bag. I had the seismic records that showed a tremor every 9 nights, regular as a heartbeat. I had the memory of a wet, tearing crunch in the dark. I started the truck and pulled back onto the pavement. I drove toward Boise. The sky was clear, the road straight and empty ahead of me. In the passenger seat, the drum recorder's needle waited, quiet and still, for the next 9th night to come around.